Welcome to Belonging at the Top, driving performance through people. The podcast where leadership gets real and people come first. Your hosts are Dr. Natalie Parks, psychologist, behavior analyst, best-selling author, and your go-to expert for dismantling systems of injustice while building equitable, high-performing teams. And Anthony Butler, leadership coach, thought leader, speaker, and master of helping leaders unlock their team's full potential, one breakthrough at a time. Together, they're here to tackle your toughest leadership challenges with just the right mix of science, strategy, and a sprinkle of humor. In today's episode, we're continuing our discussion on the return to the office, but with a focus on managing relationships now that teams are in person and face-to-face.
Welcome to Belonging at the Top podcast with myself, Anthony Butler, and Dr. Natalie Parks. This session, we are going to make it a part two of the last one, of going back to Cali / the office, because we got a lot of great feedback, and there's some other nuances we want to discuss. So we're just going to take this time to dive into how we, as leaders, deal with the relationships that we have to manage as folks are coming back into the office, especially dealing with conflict. So Natalie, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Can't complain. So looking forward to this discussion today, though. I think it was a great pivot for us. Shortly after we launched the last episode, there was an article, and I saw on LinkedIn, I forgot who posted it, but I'll give you credit somewhere else if I haven't already. But it looks like it's a magazine called HR Drive about how returning to the office really has an impact on women in the workplace. And it's not a good one.
I think we talked about last time kind of the impact just for women, but especially for families of children, right? And just having more flexibility and maybe not even children, but people who have to provide care to other people. But this article really talked more about discrimination and harassment. It's another point of why flexibility in hybrid situations are important. We also need to think about that eliminating being in the workplace together doesn't actually eliminate the problem, right? And so if this article is saying that gender discrimination is more likely when everyone is in the office together, we need to really address that. We don't need to say, okay, well, let's just all stay home. No, let's figure out how to actually get along while we're in the office together.
And I think that's what you and I come from. And I definitely agree. That's the whole point of what we mean by belonging anyway. We want to eliminate those things from happening. But I think what we'll see now, what managers will have to deal with, the leaders would have to deal with, is that now you're going to have to manage through challenges that you weren't having to manage as much before if you were in a virtual environment, because the asshole down the hall didn't bother everybody because they weren't down the hall. They were on the computer at home, down the street in their home workspace. So you didn't have to deal with them outside of that phone call or Slack messaging, whatever your exchange would be with them. You didn't have those in-office interactions, whether they be water cooler, coffee station, going out to lunch, the elevator ride up to your floor, whatever it may be. You don't have those opportunities for that extra engagement at home when you're virtual. So I think what the article points out is that now when people coming back into the office, that's going to increase naturally because you're now in the same proximity with other people. So yeah, I totally agree with you. It's not that the answer is, oh, let's go back to virtual to eliminate it. I think if folks are following our work, the work we do on this podcast and individually, is that you want to change that behavior and remove it from the office in the first place. But if you're a leader coming back into the office, and especially if you're a new leader who you've never had to manage in person, you now have to tap into a different skill set to manage those behaviors, because they will happen. It does exist. It hasn't been eradicated from the workforce yet, but you're going to have to tap into a new skill set coming into the office, especially if you do not have the experience of managing or leading a team who's actually in person, and then managing that conflict, those differences that will come out through that extra social behavior happen when you're in the office together.
I think the other thing to remember as a leader is that it's not just that people are doing poor behavior left and right, but when you're all in the office together, there are just so many more interactions that are happening naturally. And even if everyone was on their so-called best behavior, because you have more opportunity, there are going to be more instances where things don't go quite right. And so we're not really focusing on the behaviors that are ultimately bad. And we will talk about those that we can all agree on. These are the things that should absolutely not happen in the workplace. But more so, what do we do when things are coming into the office, communication errors are happening, all of a sudden we have a disagreement or a blow up, or you walk into your weekly team meeting and recognize that two people are not speaking to each other and it's making the whole environment awkward and hostile. How do we navigate those things? Because it's really difficult to create kind of this uncomfortable atmosphere because we disagreed when we're online. I could just mute my microphone and not look at you and look at somebody else. But if we're in the room together and we're sitting around the table and you're right across from me and I am now actively not looking at you, everyone else notices.
That's when you leave the meeting, you still see them. Lunch comes
Right.
around, they're still right across the hall. You're going to pass them in the hallways, right? So that awkwardness you could avoid when you can just turn on camera and finish the meeting and not have to see them at all until the next scheduled meeting, whenever that would be. You don't have
Right.
that luxury anymore if you're going to be in person.
And how do we also navigate those situations? Like you said, you're still in the hallway, but what about that person who is so excited that you are all back on the office and you are not? And so they come by your office to pick you up for the meeting and they walk you back from the meeting and they want to go get lunch together and go fill every moment of free time that you could possibly have at work.
Right.
And now you're not getting your work done and you don't really actually like this person too much. They get on your nerves. How do we navigate those and how do we still create an environment where everyone can show up and do their best and feel good about it while also establishing some ground rules?
There you go. And
So
I
that
think
more
that's probably one of the first tips I would throw out there
Yep.
for new leaders is establish those kind of ground rules earlier, right? I think, and I think for those of you who are new leaders or new leaders who are dealing with this for the first time with an in-person team, that these skills aren't some groundbreaking new things that you got to go and get trained for. They're pretty common sense leadership skills. You just got to be intentional about applying them in this situation. So I think one of them is to make sure that you are establishing an environment of open communication where you do have that ground rules being we can disagree, but disagree with respect. That you want to, as an example of a ground rule, but encourage those open forums where people are exchanging information. Because again, that's the whole point of why you want to come back in the office. You want that exchange. You want that creativity that comes from being there and having that real time exchange of ideas that you can't always get when you're remote. But you want to do that in a way that people are still respectful. You can show your ideas. You can be passionate about your ideas. You can differ about those things, but do it in a way where people really have an understanding that we're still professionals. We're going to handle this as adults. We're going to speak to each other as adults. And so that it's something that you set that tone initially. It's easier to then reinforce when someone steps outside of those parameters.
Right. I think it's also a matter of establishing and modeling as a leader, uh, taking ownership of where you are, right? So that ownership communication, so to speak, in terms of if you don't understand a point that someone is making, there's a difference between saying you're not being clear and I don't quite understand. Can you help clarify? One
Right.
of them puts the blame on the person who's communicating, the other takes ownership that for whatever reason you're not understanding. It could be because the other person's not being clear. It could also be because you were only half listening, or they're using terminology that you don't understand. So, keeping those kind of I statements, but the I statements in terms of I'm taking ownership of where I am and not blaming other people for where I am. I'm just stating I don't understand. How do we move forward? It's nobody's fault, but this is where we are. Let's move forward.
Yep. And I think that's part of that. Another way of looking at that is what we call active listening, right? Making sure that you are seeking to understand, not to really get your point across all the time, especially if you're a leader and you find yourself in the mediator role between two subordinates. I think that's when
Yep.
becomes important as well. And then you add the layer of you've got two subordinates. One of them you don't like too much anyway, but you still being a fair and good manager. You got to be careful not to let your bias then have you make decisions based on who you like better than the other person. So I think one of them,
Right.
if there is a skill, I think that a new leader or any leader who's struggling with getting through some roadblocks between communication and conflict between team members is make sure that you are using active listening, meaning, again, you are listening to understand. You're not interjecting your own thoughts and behaviors, but you really are trying to get to the understanding of the why, what's going on, peeling back the onion, so to speak, to see what the layers of the situation is, so you can then effectively manage whatever that is and get to the point where your team can be more productive and high performing, as opposed to being mired down with the he said, the office politics, and who doesn't like who, and who don't want to sit next to somebody in the conference room. You want to get around and above those things, because they will be roadblocks to whatever your mission is, whatever your goals are. You won't accomplish them if you are constantly managing those situations. So I think, again, as a takeaway from this, I was mastering the skill of active listening. And you said it earlier as well, making sure that we are modeling the behavior of what open communication looks like, open, respectful communication, professional communication looks and sounds like. That'll be a great way to create that culture as you're bringing your team back into the office.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I'm thinking of is we're talking about active listening, and our listeners will probably always hear us lean into active listening. I think that's just like on repeat. Listen, try to understand what people are saying, but also recognize, as we mentioned in our last episode, that people are coming to work, especially initially, as you're returning to work. And I would say this is going to, when we say as you're returning to the office, we're looking at 3 to 6 months of transition time. People are bringing the load that they're carrying outside of work with them to the office. And it's likely that people are going to respond a little more emotionally. They're going to roll their eyes a little bit more quickly, those types of things. So another thing to do, in addition to that active listening and being a more neutral third party, is also helping refocus on those positives. And so when you do have a disagreement and you can find resolution, you can find shared values, shared goals, those types of things. And I think that leads kind of to the next one, is what are our shared goals as a team? What can we work towards together? Because you're always going to have differences, but we're all here to work. And at work, we should hopefully have a shared agenda to get through. If not, tune in later, because we'll solve that later.
More to come on that topic in part 3. Now, but I think that is a critical point, because even as you mentioned, like the transition time of being 3 to 6 months, I think that's the individual transition time. Folks are already back in the office. They're listening to this now in their earphones, possibly sitting at their desk, trying to manage this and getting this information as they're trying to manage it. But I think that's the disconnect between the expectation. I know they're here in the DMV that a lot of federal workers are back in the office, and it's the agency trying to figure it out. It's folks trying to figure out where they're going to sit, if they have credentials to the right building. All those things are still happening. Meanwhile, you're still trying to figure out this new schedule I have for pick up and drop off for my kids and their activities and their sports and their travel ball, whatever it may be. That's still happening and hasn't been worked out yet. You're kind of still figuring that out and what works. So I think that transition goes both logistically for the organization and for the employee individually at home. And it's going to take a while before all those kinks are kind of worked out and people figure out what really works for themselves and what works for their family, and then leaders figuring out what works for their team actually as they're back in the office. I think those are things that everybody's got to really kind of remember as well. I just want to point that out, that it's a transition on both sides, and some people are building that plane as they're flying it. I mean, it's happening now for some folks. They don't even have the time to actually get it done.
And you may be one of those leaders that is mandated back in the office who doesn't want to be, and now you're figuring out how to see the good in it because your employees don't want to be there either. And you may be one of those leaders who, even like me, last week, I thought I reworked out my schedule. And even though I do most things at home, my counterpart was called back into the office full time, which requires some shifts. And right as we got the schedule worked out, a kid got sick. And so everything is back in the wind. And so now, even though this week is worked out, I'm carrying the burden of last week with me still.
Right.
And if you're, again, understanding that the return to office doesn't just affect the people who are actually in the office, but there are many, many layers to it. And so how do we show up? And I think that's where we go into that kind of second point that we're talking about is what are the common goals? What can we all get behind? What can we all get excited about? And I think this is where, on some level, we are here to work. And hopefully, most of us are, at least on some level, excited about the work that we're doing. And how do we always keep the mission and the vision of our organization, of our position, of our team, of the individual work that each of us are doing at the forefront of all of this? Because I may not like Bobby, who stops by my office to escort me to and from the meetings. I may want to walk to a meeting by myself sometimes. However, if I can recognize that Bobby is just really, really excited about the work that we're doing and the work that we're doing together, I might be able to approach Bobby a little bit differently.
Right. Showing some grace that because you might be in a situation where nobody wants to be back in the office, but you're all there. So you've got to extend some grace to other people, especially in the transition period. I think the other thing that'll help is celebrating the wins early and often. So it's not just as you figure these things out, find a way to really reinforce and celebrate and share those successes. Do some benchmarking with other teams, with the people on your team, especially if people are finding ways to creative ways to manage this as you move forward. I think that'll be a great way to, again, it goes back to the first point of having an open forum and open communication, that if you are encouraging people to share their ideas and how they're working through the stress, the challenges that coming back into the office has put on their family, that's another way for employees to bond, to build a culture around something that they may not like or appreciate at the time, but they've got to do because they value their jobs and they need their jobs. So I think that's one way to do it as well, is that it's not just a common goal of whatever the business, it's not just recognizing the business success, but recognize the operational successes, right? So it might not be a stated goal for your KPIs or whatever your stated metrics are for your department or your team, but it's a success because you managed to do something that made the transition a bit easier. So I think even to that point of just being able to recognize that early and share and highlight those often will be a great thing. On the other side, I think another skill set for leaders will have to be making sure that you can address problems and address that conflict, address it just as early as well. Don't let things fester and grow over time, because it's just going to get worse. So the earlier you can identify that something is not working, put some brain power into it, put some time into it, put on those active listening ears and figure out what you can do as a leader to help identify and analyze and resolve those conflicts in a timely fashion, so that it's not something that your team's gonna be burdened with trying to figure out how to get through it, or it doesn't add to an environment that brings down the morale as well. So if you can point those things out, call it out when it happens, and get through it, I think that's going to help your team get used to this new normal of being back in the office, which is a new old normal. This pre-COVID life work style, but still it'll help manage the expectations of the team. It'll help manage the morale of the team, and it'll help get you some buy-in as you're all forced to come back in. But being able to spot problems quickly and address them and move on, highlight the wins and the successes of your team, will go a long way to building that morale to get everybody to a point where this is now comfortable. The team is working as a team, and everybody respects each other and can communicate in a professional way.
And I think you made a really good point. I think two things, hopefully I won't forget them both, but the first one is recognizing those quick wins or the small early wins. And you mentioned, even if they're not directly related to your KPI, but if we understand that KPIs are reached when people are performing at their best, the only way to get people performing at their best, especially if they are now forced into a condition that they weren't super excited about, is to start celebrating those early wins. Yep. And so while no, it's not that production was up or profitability was up or what have you. It was the fact that, hey, we resolved this conflict before it grew into a big time waster. Let's celebrate that. Or we identified this problem before it became a problem. Let's celebrate that, because that does actually translate into your KPIs.
Yep,
Uh,
exactly.
I think the second thing is leaders who are really good at identifying conflicts that are arising, conflicts that are happening, and addressing them head on, versus those leaders who stick their head in the sand because they are conflict avoiders, do much better. And
Yeah.
I can think of an organization where everybody was in the office anyway because they were essential employees for the most part. And their leader, however, was more of a people pleaser, right? And so, Anthony, you come to me and you have an issue with Bobby. And those of you, Bobby is always my random employee. My dad's name is Bob, and I don't know, since the beginning of time, I have always used Bobby as my target. So there's no real Bobby, but Bobby is Anthony's like, I just can't stand Bobby. He gets on my nerves, this, that, the other. And Natalie, can't you just reassign Bobby to go work with somebody else? Right. And I've seen an organization where the leader is such a people pleaser. They like, I would tell you whatever it is that you want to hear in that moment. But then Bobby comes through my door and complains about the exact same thing. And now I tell Bobby whatever he wants to hear in the same moment. And those are conflicting things now. Right. And so then at some point, somebody talks to both you and Bobby and they find out that I'm just flipping left and right. Or maybe Bobby is a louder one. And so I'm telling you everything you want to hear. But in larger groups, I go with whoever is loudest or the squeakiest wheel or that type of thing. And that is largely a problem of not being able to solve conflicts well
Yep.
or have those critical conversations. And so if you find yourself as a leader shying away from that, that's where I would say maybe getting some coaching or getting some training in that conflict resolution and having those difficult conversations. Because as many leaders as I have heard, like, I'm not here to be a conflict resolution or tell people how to get together and get along in the sandbox. No, that's exactly what a leader is.
I think that goes
No.
back to our last episode when we talked about what a leader needs to do when they're in the office. So they actually be in the office. So it's still you're not going to be able to identify that conflict if you're in your office behind closed doors all day.
Yeah.
After you've mandated that everyone, you or someone else has mandated everyone comes back into the office. So you still have to be not a people pleaser, but you have to be out with the people to really
Right.
understand what's going on. You have to have, and some people don't have that as a natural skill. So it may be
Right.
some more personal development that you might have to pay more attention to the cues of interpersonal and nonverbal communication that's going on among your team. And if you don't have that skill set, identify an ally, a number two, a captain, someone else who you have a rapport with to be able to come to you and say, hey, you need to look at this situation because I don't think you see it, but this is happening in the department. And have that be someone who is not bogged down again in the office politics, but is reporting that or having those communications with you because they see a valid issue and are bringing it to your attention because they need you as a leader to address it. Because that's what, again, to your point earlier, being a leader is part of being a leader is resolving conflict. There's no way of getting around that, not at all.
And I think that also brings back, I think identifying a person or several people, and that goes back to having that more open communication. If people see you as the leader, as someone who welcomes feedback, who is responsive, who immediately tries to help solve problems, who jumps in when it's needed, they are going to be more likely to come to you and say, hey, there's this thing brewing over here that may be off your radar. But, because they are not only bought into the success of their positions, but now they're bought into the success of the team and the success of you as the leader.
Right.
And so also thinking about like how you cultivate really strong teams is through leadership that is open and receptive and helping and jumping in and present.
Right. And part of that openness, and I'm going to do some shameless plugging for you, is understanding what your own biases and prejudices are, right? And so, because sometimes you don't know there's a problem because it's not something that you are either it's outside of your culture, you don't see it. That's something that you have to deal with that because of your gender or your socioeconomic status. So sometimes we don't see those things because we don't see ourselves in that issue. So I recommend folks read The Behavior of Social Justice, chapters 15 through 18, that'll help you. Oh, written by, who's that there? Dr. Natalie Parks and colleagues. I'm not one of the colleagues, but great work in here about understanding bias, microaggressions, prejudice, and stereotypes. I think if you're a leader who needs some help around those things and understanding what those things mean beyond the standard stuff we think about of race, gender, et cetera, but it really is about understanding why we do them, where they come from, and how to break those things down to manage through them. Great tips in this book to help you through that. We'll add it in some notes somewhere or do another blast on social media. But Natalie, kudos to you and your team. Great book. I thought they were well written and I've enjoyed reading it. But for leaders who are looking for a resource, that's an example of one where not heavy lifting, not a heavy read at all, but gives you some perspective and the basis of a skill set to kind of get through that. Even if you don't have the funds to go through a professional development course or hire an executive coach, there are things out there like this podcast, like that book, that can help you through managing those things so that you do become and can really be more open to these situations as you are experiencing them back in the office.
Well, thank you for that, Anthony.
Didn't mean to make you blush, but I thought it was appropriate for today's episode.
I appreciate that. Absolutely. And I think in general, the more self-aware you are as a leader, the better off that you can be. We have talked about several things throughout here. Just to kind of summarize a little bit, we're talking about what do we do as leaders when we are all now back in the office? Things are not going quite as smoothly as we would hope. There are conflicts brewing, they're arising. You're starting to see those interpersonal dynamics show up that we just didn't have to deal with when everyone could log off Zoom as soon as the meeting was over and maybe only stayed to chat because they wanted to talk to the other people. So as a quick recap, setting clear ground rules. This is how we communicate. This is our way of communicating with one another. Really working on your active listening skills, modeling those active listening skills, mediating and helping others to work on their active listening skills, encouraging that open and honest communication, finding common goals within the team, celebrating those early wins and those quick achievements. And I think continuing to be flexible, understanding that we are all still transitioning, even though it looks like the transition ended and we're back, we're still transitioning and figuring out all those kinks. Right. Anything to add there?
No, I think that was a great summary. I think I want to probably end on a high note, again, embracing that flexibility. I think a lot of what we're talking about really is about that as a leader, that you've got to be flexible to what's going on in real life with your employees as they're coming back in and managing a transition. You've got to be flexible to the nuances that are happening and be open to and embracing the differences that you're going to find as people are back in the office that you probably did not realize in a virtual format because you didn't see them living those differences out on a day-to-day basis in an actual in-person environment. So I think as leaders who are open to that, looking for their own self-development, there are opportunities there that the more you can work on yourself, being able to identify those differences, being able to identify their conflict and to resolve them quickly. At the same time, make sure you are honoring your team and you are highlighting their successes early and often. I think it'll be making this transition back to the office a lot smoother for everybody involved.
All right. With that, we will hopefully see you next time. And just remember, great leadership starts with belonging.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Belonging at the Top. We hope it sparked new ideas for fostering belonging in your leadership journey. If you found it insightful, please like and subscribe to our podcast for more thought-provoking discussions. We'd also love it if you could share it with others who might benefit from the conversation. If you have any feedback or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please email us or drop us a note on Instagram